Okay, thank you everybody. It's our last event of the day. And so our policy discussion leads on from what Steve was talking about an hour ago. I imagine you all heard that. So we won't go over too much of that again, but there are some relevant things that we ought to talk about regarding how the labour markets function, and especially how European labour markets function, and some policies that we can think of to make the best of these changes in work and to lessen the negative impacts for people who would be negatively affected by it. Steve, I wouldn't ask you to repeat everything from the last hour. It was great though. The very quick summary that you have of this that would help us to establish what we're going to talk about in terms of how these changes in working conditions affect people who are working and the people who are employing the people who are working.
The pandemic instigated a big increase in work from home. That's a worldwide phenomenon among college-educated people. It's played out to a different extent in different countries for a whole variety of reasons, including the obvious reason that the college-educated class differs as a share of the workforce across countries. The types of jobs people do differs across countries. That's point one. Point two, things have really settled down in terms of the overall work from home intensity in most countries since early 2023. Despite what you might read about in media narratives about return to the office, there hasn't been any reversion back to traditional work modes in the economy as a whole since early 2023. Point three, there's great heterogeneity in people's desires to work remotely. Okay, so there's a lot of heterogeneity in preferences. So in some basic sense, the fact that we can now satisfy this heterogeneity much more than we could before is a positive development. And there are many reasons why people like work from home: time savings and money savings of commuting, greater sense of personal autonomy, relaxation of locational constraints, both residential and joint location constraints. These things are ability to live where housing is cheaper and keep your job while you only commute in 2 days a week. These things are important, big, they're first order direct effects of the increase in remote work. On the labor demand side, what has emerged is also a great deal of heterogeneity in the extent to which employers accommodate these preferences on the part of many to work remotely. So we've gravitated from a situation in which there's kind of one main working arrangement that holds for most workers in the economy to a much greater variety of outcomes with respect to whether you work in a traditional arrangement, you work 2 days a week at home, or some people even work 5 days a week or most of the time at home. Okay, so these things, in my view, and I tried to sketch out some of this, are largely positive in their first order direct effects. They have a whole bunch of equilibrium consequences in terms of residential housing prices, nearness to suitable jobs. They have fiscal consequences, as came up with my conversation, very brief response to Mary Ann's comment. So there's a whole complexity of these responses, and we'll probably get into some of that now.
Yeah, just a very quick follow-up on that, because some of your work was international, but some of it was US-based, and some of the very positive results were US-based. How much of that do you think is obtained from the particular institutional arrangements that there are in the US, labour markets, management styles, the sorts of houses that people live in?
Yeah, those are good points. They're relevant. So the US is a bit of an outlier, as is the UK and Canada, in the extent of the shift to work from home. And it does have to do partly, I think, with management styles. So if you think about it, one of the challenges in moving to a remote work environment is you need to somehow assess the performance of your employees when you can't see them directly. If you have a management style where you were already accustomed to evaluating people basically on their outputs, so to speak. It's easier to make that transition than if you have a management style that's basically focusing on people, what they're doing, and so on. So this kind of management style where there's more, but even before the pandemic hit, I'm going to generalize a bit here, but management practices that were more suitable for compensating, evaluating, promoting people based on outputs rather than observed inputs was already more prevalent in the Anglo-Saxon countries. That is one of many reasons why I think you've seen a bigger shift to work from home in the United States, the UK, and so on. So that's relevant. You asked me about something else. Yeah, good point. Americans, by and large, have big houses.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that is certainly a factor. So, in terms of, I didn't mention it in my talk, but in terms of the productivity ramifications of shifting to remote work, there are kind of three productivity killers. One is lack of access to high-speed internet, lack of reliable access to high-speed internet. That's not an issue in most rich countries, although even in the United States, there's a 10-15% of the population that doesn't have good broadband access at home. And certainly when you look at middle-income countries, it's a big deal. Second big productivity killer is you, the worker, are responsible for also watching your preschool-age kid and managing them while you're at home. That doesn't go very well with productivity. The third one is space to work. So if you don't have the capacity to provide a dedicated room where you can work free of distractions from other things that are going on in the household, that is also a productivity detriment. And that's much less of an issue in the United States, at least for the affluent class, than it is in some places.
Éric, can I come to you? Because you have done research work on how these new ways of working are playing out in France. What's happening what are you seeing in your research?
In France, as in the US, I think we had also a huge increase in work from home and a persistent one after the pandemic. And in France also, it was mainly a shock to the work arrangement of upper level occupation people and to a less, and even more, in fact, to mid-level occupation people, because before the shock, they were they weren't working from home at all. So it's for them for the middle class that we had the most important shock. And so in this respect, I don't think we have very different experiment at end with France. Then, using this design, using this unexpected and large shock to work from home, it's possible to look a little bit to what happened to the labor outcome and the health outcome of people who have been hit by the shock. So we have done that extensively. We have also built on the fact that the shock was not exactly has not exactly the same magnitude in all firms. This is because of the legal framework in France has not had exactly the same magnitude in all firms, depending on whether they had signed collective agreement on work from home before the shock. The red tape cost and so on are lower when you want to switch on or switch off, both for the employer and the employee, if some kind of agreement is made. So we have a kind of natural experiment. We've trained relatively good before. The two groups of firms are very similar and follow very similar trend before the shock. And then both, we have this huge shock and a differential shock across firms because of arrangement that was not exactly the same, that were not exactly the same in the two types of firms. So it gives room to look at whether what happened in the firm where the shock has been the largest, where the work from home has increased the most because of some pre-shock arrangement. And when we do that, we don't find much, in fact, in terms of labor outcome, at least for the direct effect. There are spillover effects, but for the direct effect on people that are concerned by work from home, we have not that much effect on the working time, small effect, marginally significant, no effect on hourly wages, so the very basic outcomes are not that much affected. So we looked also at less traditional outcome, like health outcomes. There is a large literature in public health documenting that there is a huge association between there is an association between working from home and some health risk associated with sedentarity. People, so when you work from home, of course, you have all the gains that Steve has mentioned. In particular, you commute less, so you have all the fatigue that goes with commuting is reduced. But at the same time, you tend to spend more time behind your screen, and there is a public health literature showing that there is an association between spending time work from home and spending time behind screen, and spending time behind screen and sedentarity, and many specific health problems like associated with sedentarity, including mortality, overweight, diabetes, high blood pressure. All these chronic diseases are associated with sedentarity. So they were ex ante possible effect in both directions. And to make it short, what we find is some progressively in the post-pandemic period, a deterioration of the health status of some group of people, particularly men, which is in line with the literature on sedentarity and health problems. It concerns mostly men. And men in the middle group also are more affected, which is also the group that has been the most affected by the first stage effect on work from home. So we have some kind of evidence with this French natural experiment that at least on the health side, things could be improved. By the way, this is consistent also with the quasi-natural literature, the quasi-experimental literature on retirement, which shows that when people go on retirement, there is a negative effect on health, especially men, and mortality and so on. So that kind of result for work from home is not that surprising if we compare it to the literature on retirement.
So are we saying that this is a direct physical health effect from just sitting around, or is there also that separation from the work environment, which is positive for some people's mental health?
Yeah, you have a literature on mental health. So with respect to mental health, as Steve said, the effect can go in both directions too. We have evidence, but it's not causal at all in the public health literature, saying that there is often an association between too much work from home and risk of mental health. Given the data that we had, we were not able to neatly disentangle between mental health issue and I think we did something, but right now I don't remember what. And at the end of the day, we were saying that it was not mental health, but sorry,
yeah,
it's too complex for me now.
Yeah, okay. Michel, I want to bring you in here because you have the information, you have the data on changing French work conditions and practices. How is France doing? And how is France doing? How is the labour market perform?
Well, I guess that Éric summed up it quite well on the aggregate figures. I think, but I don't know the US figure, actually, the level of recourse to teleworking. What we have at the moment in France is something like 25% of the workforce is in a way acting in teleworking. What I think could complement maybe the previous discussion is things we've done looking at the working conditions that people are experiencing in teleworking compared to on-site work. The information we have is through a survey, so with all the caveat that should be links to these sources. But what we see is that we have some kind of mixed, of nuanced impact of the teleworking on the working conditions of people that are exposed. This is, I would say, in the survey we had mainly through psychosocial risks, so a bit about the mental issues you mentioned earlier, and very much less through more physical issues. But I should have reviewed completely the data we have to see whether the sedentarity issue was in the survey. To give you an idea about the improvements we saw in the survey, they were mainly about increasing autonomy and reducing work intensity, and notably through issues like having less time pressure to do your job, or having fewer task interruption. You don't need to go from one job to the other when you are in teleworking. So those are the main improvements you can see in the survey. In the drawbacks we saw were, and I guess it's well known, you have reduced support from your colleagues and your superiors, which could relate to the management issue. Maybe I come back on that a bit later. Still, what we see also in the survey is that there is still a strong demand, even everyone is not participating. To give you a view of that, we looked at the people who were in jobs that were teleworkables, but were not teleworking. And 2/3 of those people would have liked to telework, so it's quite a large percentage of people. At least it shows that what they see is that it's positive for them to go to telework. Maybe to go a bit further in this discussion, I like to have some reflection. Even if we don't have any direct link between teleworking and some externalities we can expect from it, what I wanted to discuss is teleworking is impacting working conditions, and what we know about what working conditions could do on some externalities. And maybe it's not as fine as it should be, as Éric mentioned about mental health or sedentarity. What I wanted to say here is that we have rather serious evidence about when you reduce, you improve working conditions, you have on the labor market less rotation, less difficulty to hire, people stay longer on their jobs. So I expect that improving teleworking is improving working conditions. So I would expect that we should find that in a way in the data. So this would be one channel, improving in some way the labor market matching process. Maybe you didn't mention productivity gains in your resume. Again, I don't have any concrete so far study telling you how much the teleworking will improve productivity, but I have some indirect clues about that, again related to the improvement of working conditions. What would be expected is that by reducing psychosocial risks, we could reduce some of the disease, sick leave, and presenteeism, which could be more or less linked to some aspect of productivity. And I understand it was mentioned in your presentation earlier. I saw also that there could be some externality towards the public finance, which is not bad news nowadays. through else. I was a bit surprised by. I should have read your paper, Éric, before coming to to this. I imagine, but again, through this channel, teleworking is influencing. What I would expect is that the general health should improve in this context. And I wanted also to finish on the unemployment scheme. If we reduce the turnover on the labor market, here also we should also reduce unemployment expenditures on average, at least, and it's rather coherent with some of the research we've done again on another consideration, but linking unemployment and comportment towards an unemployment scheme in the context of improving or deteriorating working conditions. What I think is really key and that we lack at the moment is definitely to have a clear evaluation of the sheer size of all these mechanisms, and I'm happy that there is one paper looking at that, and that, again, I should have looked at before.
I mean, we have the problem that at the moment we have some data, but clearly it's in very early stages and things are changing so quickly that it is quite hard to be sure exactly what policy innovations we should be looking at.
Let me say a couple things, not just about that, but first, if you want to see my summary of this state of the evidence on the productivity effects associated with work from home, look at my 2023 Journal of Economic Perspectives paper with Nick Bloom and Jose Maria Barrero. It's a complex story, but let me just summarize it very quickly and then go on to your question. So an obvious point, which we all know, is that the capacity to work from home effectively differs by job, by person, and by organization, because it depends on how the organization functions. So there's no one answer to the productivity question. That said, I think once you get beyond the disruption of the pandemic itself, the balance of the evidence suggests that there's a mildly positive effect associated with working from home in a hybrid mode in those organizations, jobs, and people who choose to do that, okay? The evidence on the fully remote work is kind of more all over the place, but you have to remember, if you go to a fully work environment, there are big cost savings for the employer on other dimensions. You don't need to maintain the same kind of physical facilities and so on. And if you let somebody work completely remotely, you can probably hire them for a lot less than you would pay them if you were in the major urban center. So on the innovation side, it's not just about what government policymakers can do, but there's a need for innovation on the employer side. Mm-hmm. One thing that doesn't work very well is you just try to keep doing everything the way you used to do it, but you switch your workforce fully or partly to remote work. Because then you lose the kind of social benefits, the mentoring benefits, the networking benefits, and so on that we all understand are associated with working in proximity. So for an employer, you need to manage intentionally the consequences of your workers not being all together 5 days a week. And certain things that you could have taken for granted that people would tacitly learn from each other and so on, you have to manage. And you have to manage that more consciously so that when people are together on a physical site, you have to make sure that they're getting the benefits during that time period. What doesn't work very well is to tell your employees, as some American firms did, oh, you young guys, you all got to come into the office so you can benefit from interacting with your coworkers. Then you sit them in a cubicle for 8 hours a day and work on their spreadsheet. And they naturally say, what the heck's the point? Why did I have to commute for an hour to come here and sit in my cubicle? So the management practices need to be quite sensitive to the need to cultivate the mentoring, the networking, and the relationship building if you're going to move away from a traditional working arrangement. On the government policy side, I think a basic point to recognize is something I've talked about before, but I'm just going to repeat it and say it slightly differently. There's tremendous heterogeneity of preferences over the desire and ability to work remotely effectively, okay, on the labor supply side. There's also enormous differences across employers in the remote suitability of their work and their organizational practices. I think the worst thing that policy could do is to force everybody into the same mold, because that loses the desire to accommodate the preference heterogeneity on the labor supply side, and it forces employers to adopt a mode of working that will be suitable for some of them but unsuitable for many others. Related to this, there's still a lot of experimentation and adaptation underway. I showed you one aspect of this in my earlier remarks, where the fraction of people who live far away from the employer continues to rise as workforces turn over. So it would be a mistake as you approach this from policy to think about, oh, we figured out what the optimal design is with respect to working arrangements, and we're going to fix that and impose it in a one-size-fits-all manner. Because I think that the great virtue of what's happened is there is much more heterogeneity now in what's feasible, and that has value on both the supply and demand sides of the labor market.
Yeah, one of the early stories about being able to work flexibly, work from home, was that it was an advantage for working women. How has that data evolved now? So what do we know about the impact on women against men? Eric, this is something that you've worked on.
Yes, well, maybe a quick reaction on Steve. In France, for instance, maybe it's not the case in the US. An employer cannot say to his employees, you are going to work from home. It has to be voluntary on both sides of the market. Both the employer and the employee has to agree on that. An employer has not the leeway to. So when I'm talking of an increase in work from home in some firms and not in others, it's always, at least in theory, on a voluntary basis. Maybe it's not the case in the US. I don't know.
Well, the U.S. labor market's more flexible than the French labor market, and there was the way choice plays out in the U.S. labor market is people switch jobs, and there was, I don't know whether this happened in France or other European countries, but there was a very well documented huge surge in people quitting and taking up employment with new employers in the wake of the pandemic. And I think it's mostly for just this reason. They were finding the working arrangements that suited them, and the employers were finding the workers who liked their working arrangements. And that process, that's how it played out in the US. Now in France, it may play out in a different way.
You cannot fire somebody because it refuses. In France, it's not a good reason to fire somebody.
Understood. But I'm just saying that in the U.S., that it did play out in that respect, in some to a considerable degree.
So it's a big difference. So in terms of gender differences, and maybe it has to do with the evaluation of if we have to talk about policies. The fact is that when I take again this French experiment with this huge upsurge at some point and with different impact across the population of firms, what we can do is to look at whether that kind of shock, of work from home shock, affects not simply the people that are concerned, but also the people that are living with those that are concerned. Is there spillover effect within the family? Does it make a difference, regardless of my own situation, when my spouse is induced to work from home, is allowed to work from home while he was not allowed before? And as it happens, we find evidence of relatively strong spillover effect within the family, meaning it makes, with respect, for example, such a key outcome as working hours, the number of paid hours people work, we have, and there is good reason for that, we have stronger effect on the number of hours worked by people when their spouse switch to work from home, rather than when they themselves shift to work from home. The main effect in our data is a spillover effect. And when we look more closely at the data, it's mainly an effect from women shifting to work from home, affecting their spouse, their male partner, making it possible for them to invest more in work. So we have a strong positive, a very large positive effect on the number of hours worked by men when their spouse, their female partner, shift to work from home. Because for many reasons, she take on more childcare, for instance, and so it free time for him. It makes it possible to maybe also the balance of domestic tasks it's not symmetrically affected by the men and assume, for instance, a model where the male take on the domestic task when he's alone at home, but as soon as the female partner is at home, then the female partner take on the domestic task. Then you have that kind of result that you can have very asymmetric effect of women shifting from home and versus men shifting to work from home on their partner. And actually, we have evidence that at least in the French setup. When the women start working more from home, the men at the same time increase his work from home and increase his number of hour work, increase his investment in work.
So there's a widening of the gender gap, basically, that comes with this.
Correct.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, I wanted to add a very quick remark on this. We don't have data looking at what's going on within one specific household with the interlinkage between the spouse or the two spouses. What we had in the surveys, it's going a bit in the, sorry Eric, but in a direction which is not completely coherent with the work you've been doing. When we ask whether the domestic charge is increasing or not for women or men in the context of teleworking, we see no real change when they don't have kids. So it's the same more or less when they don't have kids. But when they have kids, the burden is shared a bit more equally between the two spouses. In this context, that's what we have in the surveys. And the other issue I wanted to mention is also something which is could be linked to the issue about whether domestic work is important or not, which is how they tell us about what is the mental load of domestic work. And again, in that case, it's the reverse. That could be coherent with Eric mentions what Eric mentioned previously. How can I say that? The gap between men and women regarding the mental load is increasing in the context of teleworking. So it's something which is maybe a bit more complex than what Eric mentioned. We have really the increase of mental load, which I understand is coherent with what you were just saying, that some people are engaging in teleworking, and one of the household is taking most of the charge, so that the other could be alleviated from the charge. But it's specific, but it's not completely specific. It could be different in the presence of kids. That's what I stop there.
So one more thing I wanted to mention before we go to questions. What are we going to do about our cities? Because they are going to be affected if our working patterns change. And how do we make sure that we retain what's good about cities and maximize that when people aren't travelling so much to centres anymore?
Great question. Relates to what Marianne asked me about earlier as well. So bear with me a second. There's a few things to think about. There's the direct fiscal consequences that Marianne asked about earlier. And what that sets up, especially when there's a decentralized fiscal support for cities as there is in the United States, it creates the potential or amplifies the potential for a doom loop in which there's a negative shock to the city's tax base. That leads it to cut back on its ability to supply local public goods, including safety, security, school quality, and so on. That makes the city less desirable as a place to live and work. More people move out, fewer people commute in. So that's the downside. There are some upsides, though, as well, and they're important to understand. The political incentives to get your act together in terms of managing a city, safe streets, good schools, and so on, increase as a consequence of this increased locational flexibility that people now have. So another way to say it is the responsiveness of both inward commuting and willingness of people to pay to live in the city, affluent people in particular, that sensitivity margin, that elasticity goes up as a consequence of increased locational flexibility. So the prediction that I've been trotting out for a couple of years or so is that in the United States, where there is this fiscal decentralization, you'd probably see an increased heterogeneity in city outcomes. Some cities have the potential to go down the doom loop side. Others, you get city managers who now say, you know what? If I can make my city a pleasant place to live and work, I'm really going to have a big impact on the local tax base, the local population, because people have so much more locational flexibility. And that's sort of what's happened across cities in the United States.
Which ones are going down the doom loop? So we know to avoid them.
So Chicago, to some extent, San Francisco, New York did, and then kind of reversed a bit. San Francisco is got such great fundamentals in so many respects that they can afford to keep making mistakes for years. Once they get their act together, people will want to live there, okay? Chicago as well, but there's some other cities that, think about what happened to Detroit decades ago. It hollowed out through a combination of people's ability to commute in from the suburbs, negative shock to industrial activity, and just poor city management. That's probably going to play out in some other U.S. cities. My hometown of Portland, Oregon, this has played out a bit. So I think there is a great risk that some cities will not make an appropriate adjustment politically. That'll set off the negative economic consequences. But there's also the upside. There's one other key thing to understand about this, and it's a different way to make the same point. Because the agglomeration, the physical agglomeration benefits of work have been reduced by the rise of telework, remote mobility, that's less of how cities can compete and succeed now. Conversely, the consumer amenity value of living in a city, you can walk around the streets in Paris, it's very pleasant. Even if you don't want to commute to work, there's still good reasons to live in major cities from the consumer side, someone who lives in a city, if you can make the city safe, secure for people. Some US cities are failing on that dimension. Others are succeeding spectacularly. So it's important to understand, if you're a city manager or a city mayor, that the way you succeed as a city is to make your place a desirable place to live. Much more so than in the past, where it used to be, you got to get the good jobs, you got to get the good job. It doesn't help you now to get the good jobs if the workers don't work in those jobs anyway, they work somewhere else and only commute into the city. So there's increased competition spatially among cities now on the consumer amenity value. And that is something that cities have a lot of control over, because a lot of it involves the quality and extent of local public goods and services.
Eric, do you think that changing ways of work will change? Well, is it going to change Paris?
So, I don't know. What I can say is that people have looked at, in terms of pollution and in terms of environment, the conventional view is, of course, that remote work should be positive because it should. It's a priori what we should think about this because of the reduction of transportation and so on commuting. But at the same time, something I didn't know, but I read with the work of some colleagues at Montpellier, Simon Briol in particular, is that in fact, when people work at home, they tend to use technology that are more polluting actually, and they emit much more fine particles. So if you take 100 people, they pollute less in terms of fine particles emission when you put them all day long in a building rather than put them all over the countryside in their home. So there is in fact a possible negative effect of working from home on the emission on fine particles. And so what they did, maybe it should be refined and so on. What they did, they look at what happened during the lockdown periods when people were when all non-essential people were working from home, and when only essential people, let's say essential job, it amounts to about 20% of the population in France, and only them were working on site. And they compare the very day of the lockdown period and the intensity of the lockdown with the days in the pre-pandemic period, the similar day, the same season, the same day of May, April, and so on. And what they do find is that at the municipality level, at least, that you have an increase in the emission of fine particles during the lockdown period when almost everyone was at home. What they did also is they compare cities with a large share of essential people and cities with small share of essential people, just to see whether the rise in emission of fine particle emission was stronger, where more people were working from home, and they do find this result. Let's say the increase of fine particle emission tend to be stronger when you have less essential people around, and so more people working from home during the lockdown. So that, of course, this is just one piece of evidence, but which I find striking and interesting.
Yeah, it's one piece of evidence, but it's a very disappointing one, isn't it? Michel, just if you have a comment on this, and then we'll go to questions.
Yes, just a quick comment. It was not clear for me whether it was a competition through this channel between cities that are far or quite close from one another. We did a paper which was not on this issue specifically, but looking at where people moved just after the COVID crisis, and whether we saw in the data some sort of link with the issue of the discussion, so teleworking. And it goes a bit along this what you were saying, that we saw things in those who were moving while keeping the same employer, moving very far. So the threshold we had is 100 kilometers. In the context of France, it's far. And it was not that big, but we had an increase of people moving after the COVID, and a large bunch of it were on jobs linked with telework, that were teleworkable. And when we were looking at things like that within agglomeration, so it's probably larger within this 100 kilometers limit, we saw no real link with teleworking, maybe because it's too small and there are a lot of other reasons to move within this area. But again, we didn't see anything. The other remark I wanted to say is about transports, which I think is it's more theoretical than anything else. But if you are going to reduce commuting, my impression is that you should have a reduction in the supply of transportation, leading to new problems in cities, and cities which are more dispersed on the territory, and so less supply with less transport, less supply of transportation, and leading probably some kind of externality which would be negative in that case. Well, we all know that most of the people, at least in France, are moving from time to time to the site where they are supposed to work, on site. And if you're far from it, well, it's more difficult. So you have some kind of difficulty on the matching of the labor market if it interacts with the transportation system. And maybe it could be of interest to look at it someday.
Okay, so now if there are any questions, I remember when it was during COVID and we were all working at home, we used to do these panels online. Do you remember that? It was the first time everyone had used Zoom. And when I took questions, there was those little yellow hands that these people had. I still have nightmares about that now. Do we have any questions from the audience with real people's hands sticking up? Yeah, there's one here, and there's also one at the back as well. After that.
I wanted to come back to Steve's point about competition at a city level and how you sort of have two margins going on. On one hand, remote work expands the possibilities for people to be able to escape a place where they feel like the amenities have gone down, crime or whatnot. But on the other hand, we maybe haven't seen as much responsiveness from cities. You think like New York maybe hasn't responded as much, New York City, Chicago, et cetera, haven't responded that much to raise amenities over the past couple of years, and people are just permanently in Miami, Austin, Nashville, et cetera. So I wonder if Steve, you could comment on it from the perspective of why don't you see more response at a city level, and then maybe if anyone else wants to comment from a like European perspective of how people value amenities like crime, safety, and school quality from a European perspective, and how people trade that off when deciding to move. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. You do see some responses, but the political process the democratic policymaking process is generally slower working to respond to problems than markets. So you shouldn't expect to see such a quick response. But even in places like San Francisco, what's happened recently? Got rid of the district attorney who didn't want to prosecute low-level crime in the city. That was very unpopular politically. Took a while for another election. He's gone. So even in San Francisco, a very progressive city is now making pretty serious efforts to clamp down on the kind of crime, to clean up the streets a bit, to make it a more pleasant place to live. They still have a ways to go, but you do see those changes. So the whole, remember there was the defund police movement in the United States. That's now, that's kind of, nobody's for that anymore, including lots of people who were for it once. So there has been a political pushback that basically I'm interpreting as, let's make our cities safe to live. There's been some pushback. It's been going, it long predates the pandemic, trying to improve public schools in the United States. That process is still playing out. It did get some extra impetus from people's experience with schooling during the pandemic, when they got the sense that the teachers' unions weren't really interested in their kids and what their kids were learning and so on. So I do think we're seeing responsiveness on the political process, but it's a much slower working process than markets. And I think the real danger is, in the United States context at least, that the political responsiveness might be too slow before, in some cities, the kind of doom loop dynamics dominates. And that's the real worry, in my view, that the political responsiveness process is slow.
European comment on value of amenity in cities?
One very quick comment. you are moving a lot faster in the US than we do in Europe, I guess, from one city to the other. So probably the political response will be also slow, but maybe could pace a bit more with the phenomenon. I have it's still a question for you. I'm sorry if I may. Do you have any idea of the size of these new movements that comes from the work from home thing and not from anything else, the development in the rest of the economy or whatever? Because one key question here is, again, the one I wanted to raise at the end of my first intervention, is whether it's big or not that big. I see the movement and the rationale and what we can see in the data, but is it big?
So we've tried to quantify this for a few cities. The short answer is it is big in the United States in some cities. We made some efforts to quantify the loss of worker spending in New York City, in San Francisco, as a consequence of the shift to work from home. Okay, and the numbers are large. Big 10 to 25% reductions in worker spending in these cities at one point. And remember that's a big hit to the local property tax base on the commercial side, and a big hit to the sales tax base. I've forgotten the numbers now, but we also, and others have done this, I think more extensively than we have, just quantified the decline in inward commuting, okay? And that brought, and I think you were alluding to this earlier, less intensive use of the transport infrastructure, including a drop in the revenue of the transport system. That has proved to be a big problem in some cities in the United States. There are a few cities in the United States that have major transport networks, like New York and San Francisco. It's not as common in the US as it is in Europe. So yeah, you can quantify some of these things, and you can also just look at the occupational distribution of the workforce, which varies a lot across cities. So I think you were alluding to earlier. And to go back to San Francisco, which I picked on for a few reasons, they have governance problems. But if you think about the profile of what's the profile of a city that was most hit by the work from home shock and the increased locational flexibility that I talked about earlier, the profile is a city with many jobs that are remote suitable, in a high tax state to encourage the arbitrage out of the state and out of the city, and in an area with high housing costs. Well, San Francisco is a poster child for all of those. So San Francisco has had such a difficult time, not just because of poor governance, which I think was a big amplifier, but because it really got hit by a much bigger negative shock than almost any other major city in the United States. And it's had a very difficult time recovering. That's been very much in the news for years now. And partly for that reason. So we can quantify these things. I haven't done it as extensively as I like, and I suspect others have done it more extensively than I have.
Eric, you have something to say about it?
Maybe one big difference is that the main dimension of the quality of a neighborhood or city is school. And schools are not that much in the end of the localities in France, much less than in the US. So then it comes down to a peer effect. Let's say what matters is what kind of people are living near you. And so then it's an equilibrium, I think, which is very difficult to break, even with the remote work tool. As a matter of fact, we have looked hard into this, and in the immediate post-pandemic period, we had some evidence that people were moving away from city center, but then it came back to the pre-pandemic situation. And my reading is that you have to be near the good peers
Is that true? Your statements about the level of population in cities, is it also true for the mix of people who live in the cities? Because there's been a big mix change in the United States too, in in the struggling cities, the people who've moved out of places like San Francisco are the people with young children.
When you look separately at people with children, upper level occupation, mid-level occupation, we have no evidence of change in commuting time in this very post-pandemic period compared to the pre-pandemic period. We had something just in the wake of the pandemic, but now we have no such change.
There was another question here.
Yeah, thanks. So my question relates to this topic of the future of cities, and we talked about how workers might adjust. I was wondering, do you have some thoughts on how firms might adjust if, well, you said that agglomeration effects might be weakened, and yeah, they could also profit maybe from lower rents or amenities elsewhere.
Yeah, who wants to take that one first?
Well, I mean, a couple points. One, firms differ greatly in their responses. Some see the shift to remote work as an opportunity to exploit because they can diversify their talent pool geographically, and which also helps diversify it in other respects. And diversify here means including to labor markets where labor is cheaper for given quality, and also just expand their access to talent. So you see some firms that say, well, fine, my competitor isn't really well situated to exploit the shift to remote work, but I am. So for me, it's a competitive advantage. And then you see other firms where either because the organization is not well suited to handle a remote or hybrid workforce, or because the nature of the work doesn't lend itself to that, they're basically going back to the old traditional model. And those are the ones that, by the way, get a lot of attention in the newspaper. So there's a great deal of heterogeneity in how firms are responding to these developments. And as I alluded to earlier, I think that's fine. I don't, unless there's regulatory forces that push everybody to do the same thing, I suspect that will continue indefinitely, where there's lots of heterogeneity across firms and how they deal with this newfound locational flexibility for themselves and for their workers.
Guys, do either of you have a comment on that? In which case, we have time for one more quick question, if there is one.
Yeah. Okay.
Last one, absolutely the last one, yeah.
Thank you very much for the conversation. I have a question about the future of if I think about tomorrow, and if the full remote working can open, for example, the borders between the countries. If we can imagine the policymakers working on, I don't know, like a universal work contract where I'm French here and I can work, for example, for the US without needing a US visa as today. And this will be, of course, regulated. It will be a legal contract, and the tax allocation between the countries will be regulated. And yeah, do you think this is possible tomorrow?
This is a fantastic idea. Is it possible?
Well, a few things. It's first, the question's framed in a very French European way, which is which is fine, but I just want to point that out. There's a lot outside Europe and many parts of the world, including the United States. There's a much looser approach to employment contracts. It's not defined in a centralized manner. It's up to the employer and the employee, subject to some limitations on what you can contract over. So it's already happening. What you described already happens to some extent. I mean, Upwork is probably the most well-known platform of this sort, where you can contract with people anywhere in the world. Now, it only lends itself to certain kinds of jobs, computer coding, information technology. I don't know how European authorities deal with somebody in Paris or or alternatively somebody in Mumbai who works for a French firm that gets hired on a gig basis on Upwork. I don't know how that's regulated. In principle, you could force them into the same framework that all other French employment relationships are. I don't know how it plays out. But there is already quite a large market of this sort across international boundaries that is, I think, pretty loosely regulated.
Short answers for hydrogen. Yep.
Just for the record that I don't know where the project is, but there was some ideas that were imagined for the functioning of the European Union, creating some additional states with the idea you had in mind, a new way of functioning of the labor market, but it didn't happen. So it's probably there is quite a huge number of barriers, notably national resistance, I guess.
Okay. All right. Work to be done in many dimensions. I think we've done about as much work here as we should do tonight. Thank you very much to the panel.